Welcome into the Steel Curtain Podcast. It's Monday, August 19th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are 0-2 in the NFL preseason after a 9-3 loss to the Buffalo Bills on Saturday night at a rainy Acrisure Stadium. I'm Josh Yourish, and today I'm going to evaluate where things stand in the Steelers quarterback battle between Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. I'm going to give you a look at what the Brandon Aiyuk potential trade package looks or looked like between the Steelers and the 49ers. And before all of that, I have to start with the offensive line and the disaster that we saw on Saturday night because the Pittsburgh Steelers might have a Broderick Jones problem. So there's been a clear directive from the very top of the Steelers organization since Omar Khan became the general manager and Andy Weidel came over from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to become his consigliere. Invest in the offensive line. That's what Weidel did in Philadelphia with the Eagles that eventually led them to the Super Bowl, and what he's wanted to do in Pittsburgh. Now the organization and Mike Tomlin specifically needs to do whatever it can to protect that investment. You're taking back-to-back first-round tackles, and right now one is injured, and one is playing out of position and struggling mightily. Broderick Jones, playing predominantly right tackle on Saturday night against the Bills, allowed 3 pressures and 2 sacks with Russell Wilson at quarterback. It was just a disaster. The offense could not function because of the liability at right tackle, and Gregory Rousseau, who's now a 4th-year pass rusher, former first-round pick of the Buffalo Bills, just manhandled him at one point, nearly throwing Jones back into Wilson on his way to his 2nd sack. And really, there's a very easy explanation for the struggles of Broderick Jones. He's playing the wrong position. Now, we've talked about this throughout the offseason and the preseason, but let's get into a little bit of the numbers with what it looks like for Broderick Jones at right tackle and at left tackle. So in college at Georgia, he played 1,396 snaps. 1,358 of them were at left tackle, just 34 on the right side of the offensive line. Now in Pittsburgh, he's played 635 regular season snaps at right tackle of his 766 regular season snaps. He's allowed 29 pressures at right tackle and just 4 at left, though in a much smaller sample size. But when we break it down even further and look at the percentages, he's essentially allowing a pressure on 7.6% of his pass blocking snaps at right tackle to just 5.4% at left. Now, those are just percentages. What do they mean? Well, over a regular season with about 600 pass blocking snaps, a reasonable amount if he stays healthy. 2 Pittsburgh offensive linemen eclipsed that number last year. That's a difference of 12.6 pressures from 45 to 32. Now, what does that mean? That's the difference between Mekhi Becton, a certified first-round bust who allowed 50 pressures on 644 pass blocking snaps, or 7.8% last year for the disastrous New York Jets, and future Hall of Fame right tackle Lane Johnson of the Philadelphia Eagles, who allowed 35 pressures on 616 pass blocking snaps, or 5.7%, which is actually still higher than Jones's 5.4% at left tackle, though in a much smaller sample size. Now, I'm not saying that Broderick Jones at left tackle is going to be as valuable or even close to as valuable as perennial all-pro right tackle Lane Johnson is to the Philadelphia Eagles. But what I'm saying is that he's markedly better on that side of the offensive line. And for some reason, he spent the entire preseason splitting his reps between right and left tackle. Well, for some reason, we know the reason. It's Dan Moore Jr. So before I get into Dan Moore Jr., I have to talk about what's making this an even bigger problem for Broderick Jones at right tackle. He has an injured right elbow. So the film junkies and the film guys, specifically Chris Carter over at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who does great work with this kind of stuff, did a breakdown of Jones's performance against the Bills and essentially says he has no power on his initial punch against the pass rusher, meaning he couldn't knock Rousseau off of his line, and Rousseau knocked him completely back nearly into the quarterback on multiple occasions. And that has a lot to do with an injured right arm, which would be the one he would be using to engage a pass rusher first. It affects his punch, it affects his extension. So he's struggling a lot there, and yet he's still playing there because Dan Moore Jr., who allowed the fourth most pressures in the NFL at 56, despite only playing 580 pass blocking snaps last year, demands to play on the left side of the offensive line because he says he can't play on the right side of the offensive line. Well, the numbers say he can't play on the left side either. Moore was one of two players with over 40 pressures allowed in less than 600 pass blocking snaps last year. And the other is Baltimore's Ronnie Stanley, who has been hurt since 2021. And at one point, the Ravens were experimenting with a legitimate platoon system where he'd play one series and sit on the bench the next because he, at one point, was the highest paid offensive lineman in the NFL. And injuries have completely wrecked his entire trajectory of his career. That is the company that Dan Moore Jr. is keeping, and yet he still had 14 more pressures allowed than Stanley did last year in a similar number of snaps. I don't care if Dan Moore Jr. can't play right tackle. He also can't play left tackle. Why have two problems at offensive tackle when you could just move Broderick Jones over to the left side, and then until Fautanu comes back, you only have one problem, whether that's moving Dan Moore Jr.'s stubborn ass over to the right side or playing somebody like Spencer Anderson, who's now moving up the depth chart because of a couple injuries on the interior of the offensive line. Throw him at tackle. He's taken some snaps at right tackle in the preseason, and he statistically cannot be worse than Dan Moore Jr. was last season. The Steelers have invested in the offensive line, but their stubbornness and their boneheaded belief in Dan Moore Jr. is making the offense non-functional. And it's not giving them a chance to truly evaluate their quarterbacks, which is the organization's most important task this preseason. There is nothing more important to the Pittsburgh Steelers throughout these preseason games and training camp than deciding if you're going to start Russell Wilson or Justin Fields in week one. And the way they're handling their offensive line is not allowing them to get a clear picture of what either of those guys are going to look like in the NFL regular season. So to this offensive line problem, the Steelers need to stop changing their offensive linemen's positions. I know I just said to move Dan Moore Jr. over. That's because he's not a valuable offensive lineman. We saw this, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, when Kevin Dotson went to the LA Rams, moved from left guard to right guard, where he said publicly he's much more comfortable, and turned into one of the most expensive guards in the entire NFL because he's also one of the best at right guard. The Steelers sent him away for a late round pick. Now they're moving Broderick Jones over to right tackle. They're also doing the same with Fautanu, which worries me a little bit, but he was a run side tackle at Washington with a left-handed quarterback and Michael Penix Jr. He's supremely athletic. I mean, you would say that about Broderick Jones too, but I believe in Fautanu's ability to do it a little bit more, and they've at least had conviction with that, right? They've named Fautanu the starting right tackle even after he had an injury, and pretty much right after on my show, I said Fautanu is not going to be able to start because of that injury. It just looked like they were going to shoehorn Broderick Jones into right tackle and leave Dan Moore Jr. over at left. This is a consistent issue with this coaching staff. And I don't know if that's Pat Myers, the offensive line coach, who has had mixed results in developing these guys, or if it's a Mike Tomlin thing. Because Mike Tomlin, for all of the things he does great in developing talent and shepherding young stars through the NFL and, keeping a lid on things in the organization with highly talented, volatile players, just overachieving in general, it doesn't seem like he understands the inherent value of a first round pick and what their development means in the NFL. And we learned this the year before Broderick Jones was drafted when Kenny Pickett was the first round pick. Now, I don't think any scenario Kenny Pickett would have developed into a franchise quarterback. I mean, a lot of people have watched him play in the preseason with the Eagles, a much better infrastructure, and he just looks horrible. A much better offensive infrastructure, I'll say. And he just looks horrible. He's checking things down constantly. He's so flighty in the pocket and terrified of pressure. Those are things that were probably always going to be there. And the physical limitations of his athleticism with the way he tried to play football were probably just never going to work. But his developmental track here was not a linear one. It was not one that made any sense. I mean, Tomlin is risking derailing Broderick Jones' development the same way he did with Pickett when he threw Pickett hastily into his first ever NFL regular season game after a halftime locker room fight against the Jets, and then Pickett threw 3 interceptions. You can't do that. I don't care how bad things were in the first half against the Jets, and I don't care how stubborn Dan Moore Jr. is or how bad he looks at right tackle. You have to put your players you've invested a lot in positions to succeed. And that's not just because you really want to be proven right. It's because there's a reason you took them so highly in the draft. These are the most talented players on your roster, either from physical gifts or production in college, whatever it is. You believed in these guys enough to draft them, or at least the front office did. And it seems like currently there's a divide between the front office and the coaching staff with how to construct the offensive line, and over the past couple of years with what to do with highly drafted players. I'm glad they're getting it right with Fautanu, just slotting him in at right tackle when he comes back from injury. He's going to be the starting right tackle. Great. Now stop wasting time putting Broderick Jones over there because you're stunting his growth. He should have gotten all the reps this preseason at left tackle. That's why he was a disaster against the Bills. He's trying to play 2 positions. This isn't Madden. You can't just move these guys around. I know Mike Tomlin knows this better than I do, obviously, but you can't just move these guys around and their rating stays the same, or, they're rated just as well as the left tackle as the right, and you can just switch them around and do whatever you want. That's not how this works. These are young athletes who are trying to make their way in the NFL, not for long, right? That's what it's always stood for. One of the most difficult leagues of any sporting league or anything. They're at the absolute top of their craft. They're trying to prove to themselves and to their team and to their coaching staff that they belong here. They need confidence and they need comfort in their position. So why are you taking that away from Broderick Jones when he hasn't even proven anything really at left tackle? You've never given him the opportunity. Mike Tomlin is risking that for a first-round pick because Dan Moore Jr. says he can't play right tackle. Maybe Jones won't pan out. Maybe he'll be a bust like Mekhi Becton I mentioned earlier. Maybe he'll be worse than Dan Moore Jr. But we have to see it. And we have to see it at the position he's best at. Because the Steelers don't have any other options. Enabling the worst left tackle in football to disrupt the developmental track of a first-round pick is entirely idiotic. The Steelers don't have a Broderick Jones problem. They have a Dan Moore Jr. problem, and that comes from the top of the coaching staff enabling him to call a shot. If you're a Pittsburgh Steelers fan like me, as I jump out of that rant, and you're just as passionate about who's playing left tackle in preseason games, then you would probably like to support the podcast. And if you're listening right now, we would love if you would do that. Please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube. We really, really appreciate your support. And now, before we get to the big ticket battle in training camp, we're going to get there. I promise we are. We're also going to get to the Brandon Aiyuk revelation of what the proposed trade package was between the Steelers and the 49ers. But before we get there, we need to wrap things up a little bit from the Steelers preseason loss to the Bills and look at the injury report, because there are some significant names on there. I'm not going to go through like who impressed late in the fourth quarter, because that game was ugly. I just want to talk about the starters and the important players for the regular season. So let's look at the injury report. And we know Beanie Bishop didn't play. He's been dealing with something of an injury. Mike Tomlin said they just didn't want to exacerbate it in the preseason game. I think the rain and the elements also kind of made both teams a little bit gun shy about who they were playing. Josh Allen didn't end up playing. He was supposed to, and then didn't. I don't know if the rain was the factor with that, but it seemed that they were being extra cautious for preseason week number 2. Jaylen Warren, grade 1 hamstring strain. The team believes, from the reports I've read, that he'll be ready for week 1. I sure hope so. There's really no reason to be giving starting running backs reps in the preseason. I don't understand that at all. The entire thing with running backs is you want to keep fresh tire, like you want to keep the tires fresh as long as you possibly can. You don't want to wear down the tread on these guys. That's all we talk about. Running backs get to 27 and they're like borderline washed up because of so many carries in college and early in their career. So why are you giving them any carries, any touches in a preseason game? It just makes no sense to me. But they did. Warren got a little banged up. Looks like it's something that he'll be able to work through to play early in the season. I don't think it really changes anything for this offense. I think it's going to be pretty much a 50-50 split, and I feel good about that. I think Warren's a much better player than Najee Harris, but I understand why Harris is going to get so many carries and the value he can provide, especially as like a short yardage back and whatnot. So I don't think that's a big deal. What is a bigger deal is Nate Herbig, the possible starting center. Not anymore, because he's out for the season with a torn rotator cuff. And that one is pretty significant. That means Zach Frazier, the second-round pick out of West Virginia, will be your week 1 starting center. And that probably should have been the case anyways. And it probably was going to become the situation regardless of Herbig's health. So that's not really the story here. The story here is the depth on the interior is going to be tested a little bit. James Daniels and Isaac Seumalo are veteran guards that you trust. Daniels has maybe taken a bit of a step back here since coming over from Chicago as a free agent, but they're solid at the guard spots. If one of those guys goes down, or Zach Frazier, who finished the end of his college career with an injury, goes down at some point, then you're really testing the depth, because you might have to move James Daniels from guard to center if he's not the one injured. And then it's somebody like Spencer Anderson or Mason McCormick elevating into that role. The Steelers have had really good luck over each of the past 2 seasons with their offensive line health. That's why for less than exceptionally talented units, they've actually been able to get by, even with the worst left tackle in the NFL. The health has really helped them, especially late in the year when we see these run game resurgences. But if they aren't so lucky this year, the depth is going to be tested. Losing Herbig is definitely something to have in the back of your mind if we get to week 8 or 9 or 10 and Mason McCormick, a 4th-round pick rookie, is suddenly your starting left or right guard. That could be a problem for the Steelers, especially with a late season gauntlet of a schedule that puts them up against short rest against very good teams a few times. So that's it for the injury report. As I reset here to get to the Brandon Aiyuk trade package. So the constant stream of conflicting reports about the Brandon Aiyuk trade situation has continued. And this is dragged out about 2 weeks now. And the latest is that Michael Silver of the San Francisco Chronicle has reported that the Steelers were and are unwilling to part with any players in a Brandon Aiyuk trade, but were planning to move, and maybe still are planning to move or are willing to move, a second and third round pick for the star wide receiver. The 49ers were then looking to parlay one of those picks into a useful wide receiver somewhere else. Omar Khan, it also says in this report, turned down offers that included George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, and even Minkah Fitzpatrick. Bits and pieces of this reporting have come out recently, and we've heard about San Francisco looking for a third team to kind of swing a wide receiver trade because the Steelers simply don't have a lot to offer there. That's why they're in the Brandon Aiyuk market. So it's kind of an interesting thing that the 49ers are considering trading a wide receiver and have decided that the number one thing they want back is a wide receiver. I mean, obviously we understand why with his impending massive contract and further down the line, the giant contract that Brock Purdy will inevitably get and the big paydays that have happened with Trent Williams and Nick Bosa and all the stars on that roster, Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel. They don't really have a lot of room to pay a guy like Brandon Aiyuk, but they want a wide receiver back. They took one in the first round, and they want one in a trade. The Steelers don't really have anything to offer in that department, especially with Roman Wilson's injury. Not that he was going to be the guy, but that was just another possibility. So the teams are seemingly at an impasse, and it looks more and more like Aiyuk is going to stay in San Fran, but no contract extension is really done there. So this is continuing to drag out, and it's lost its steam, right? It's not as sexy of a story as it was 10 days ago, but it's still interesting. It's still something Steelers fans frustrated by a 9-3 preseason loss where they played their potential week one starting quarterback all the way through the second half and still couldn't put up any points. It's something that a lot of Steelers fans would be very interested in because he's a bona fide number one wide receiver. Now, I had Chris Muller on last week. He believes a little bit less in the value of Aiyuk as a number one. But I look at him as a number one guy who can win against some of the best corners in the league. If you can get him isolated, he doesn't need to thrive on the gimmicky Shanahan stuff. He benefits from it. His efficiency is excellent because of the Shanahan stuff. I don't think he needs it to succeed. And yet, even at the great price, because a second and a third would be a really good price for one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Most of those guys go for one, if not multiple, first-round picks. Reportedly, that was not on the table for Brandon Aiyuk, and the Steelers were not willing to part with any of their good players along with those picks. The deal hasn't gotten done, so it's hard to give Omar Khan any credit for that, right? It's not like he swung this deal and really did get Aiyuk for a second and third, but it seems like that's the deal that's been on the table, and it's been close at certain times. That's a good trade. The Steelers would, in my estimation, be getting the better end of it. But that trade doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? If you're grading it, the Steelers would win the trade. They get an A, whatever. That's not how these things work. There's an exorbitant amount of machinations in these organizations, and winning one trade like that doesn't necessarily mean you're setting up your team best to win a Super Bowl at some point, because that's the entire point of this. The Steelers are not in that window. The 49ers are. So I still wouldn't at that price make a Brandon Aiyuk trade, because you then have to pay him $28 to $30 million a year. So a massive 4-year, probably $30 million a year contract, maybe 28. There's been rumors he'd be willing to take a little bit less from the Steelers. Okay, that would be nice. you're still locking yourself into a massive contract for a wide receiver when a potential George Pickens contract is going to come up next offseason. And that's something you got to talk about. Okay, so are you locking yourself in to two massive wide receiver contracts when you don't have a quarterback? That's just not something I'd do, because I'd be more interested in finding that quarterback, and we can go from there. Now, again, this team needs help on offense. We saw that. Brandon Aiyuk doesn't move the needle enough to make it a Super Bowl contender. So even at a 2 and a 3, it's good value. It'd be a fair contract. But one of my favorite things about the Steelers situation is their flexibility, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I wouldn't sacrifice that for Aiyuk. I don't think he's that level of player, even if I think he's a legit number one wide receiver. So patience is my best prescription when looking at the Brandon Aiyuk situation. And I think it seems like it's done. It seems like it's cool to the point that the Steelers will not go into week 1 with Brandon Aiyuk on the roster. And the 49ers, I would bet, do get something done with the wide receiver, either to placate him this year or to sign him long-term and have him be part of the exceedingly expensive core out in San Francisco. And now, what we all want to talk about, it's Russell Wilson versus Justin Fields. And the Steelers quarterback battle and the update on pole position. So let's get into it. One of the biggest reasons that the Steelers offense struggled in preseason game number 2 against the Bills, a 9-3 loss, was the offensive line. Specifically Broderick Jones. There were breakdowns with Wilson in the game. It caused multiple 3-and-outs. The offense never really got any traction. But don't let the storyline of Broderick Jones, of the struggles of this offensive line, overshadow how pedestrian Russell Wilson looked. Because it was not pretty. He's a quarterback who was known for so long as a guy who can make something out of nothing. Chicken salad out of chicken shit, if you will. And there was none of that. There was none of that against Buffalo. Whether it's a nagging calf injury or the fact that the Monongahela River is not the fountain of youth that Russell Wilson thought he found this offseason, Wilson had no mobility. And that's a problem when the first half of the season, you're going to be breaking in 2 new offensive tackles. Broderick Jones new-ish at left tackle. He's essentially new for the Steelers. Once they finally get to their inevitable starting offensive line with Jones at left and Fautanu at right. So for all the worry about Jones and the offensive line, Wilson was only pressured on 3 of his 13 dropbacks. That doesn't sound bad. And he posted a 100% pressure to sack ratio. That sounds bad. It is. It's really, really bad. It's a very small sample, but he didn't escape pressure at all. He's not mobile anymore. Calf injury or washed up. I don't care. It's the same result. It's Russell Wilson on his backside and the Steelers in 2nd and 17. So last year, 20.7% pressure to sack ratio. That's a lot better than 100%. It was still 3rd worst in the NFL among starters with at least 500 dropbacks. And the guys he was behind, Bryce Young and Sam Howell. That's really good company. Funny enough, Baker Mayfield was the guy behind him in 4th. So those are 3 possibly all under 6 foot NFL quarterbacks. There's something to wanting to have a little bit of size at that position. Unless you're early years Russ and can scamper around like crazy, it kind of matters to be, 6 foot tall on your tippy toes. He's been over 20% in pressure to sack ratio in 4 of his last 6 years in each of the last 3. Fields had a career best pressure to sack last year, only 19%, so not that much better. Still not good. But we saw on Saturday night the mobility that Fields possesses and the opportunity to turn scrambles into big plays with his legs or with his arm, because he did both. Now, Fields doesn't look very comfortable operating in this offense, but neither does Wilson. Fields' time to throw is a staggeringly high 3.93 seconds on average in this preseason, and Wilson's at 2.64. They have opposite problems. Fields is holding onto the ball for a really long time looking for a big play to come open, and Wilson's just getting the thing out because he knows he can't move anymore. And both are making this offense stagnate. Fields is actually holding onto the ball for 4.71 seconds when pressured and 3.32 when clean, both incredibly high numbers that will not work in the NFL regular season. We saw Wilson go 8 for 10 for 47 yards and Fields 11 for 17 for 92 yards and 42 yards rushing on 8 carries. I'll take the second one, please. It's still not perfect. It's still not operating within the confines of the Arthur Smith offense, which is grip it and rip it over the middle. Neither of those guys is going to do that, but at least you have more to play with Justin Fields. Wilson has never been good at executing a quick passing game. We saw that on Saturday. He missed multiple reads, and while his completion percentage was really high, did you notice how every time somebody caught the ball, they were immediately tackled? That's because he's not going to the right guy in these situations. That's never been Russell Wilson's strength. His strength is scramble drill, or at least was scramble drill, and bombs down the sideline. You didn't see either of those. And if the Steelers know he's limited in his mobility, they're going to want him to get the ball out quickly. And that's exactly what Wilson wanted to do his first year in Denver with Nathaniel Hackett as the head coach. And it was a disaster. That was his plan. He was going to become Drew Brees late in his career. And he just cannot do it because it's not easy to be Drew Brees. Fields looked much better. He still had his mistakes, but he can make up for that with his legs and a great deep ball. His one deep ball wasn't caught, but we'll get into why. And let's look at the two biggest mistakes that Justin Fields made. The Steelers go for it on fourth down, 4th and 2 from the 9, late in the third quarter, down 6-3. So a situation in a regular season game, you'd obviously kick the field goal. They just wanted to see what they had with Fields. Buffalo calls a timeout. Coming out of the timeout, Arthur Smith calls a read option. One he had called earlier on the drive that Buffalo played well then, and with extra preparation time for it, they played it well again. Now, this was the plan for the Steelers. Mike Tomlin said it coming out of halftime to Missy Matthews. He said they wanted to get a look at Fields' athleticism and the running game. So they did, and it didn't work out very well. But it's not really on Justin Fields. If you watch that play from behind, it looks like the running back has a clear lane into the end zone, and he certainly may have if Fields handed off the ball. But the defender that Fields is reading is on the left side of the defensive line, and he stunts in, which is a keep read for the quarterback. Now, the defensive lineman played it pretty well, and then Buffalo had a linebacker crashing down behind him to snuff the play out because it was an incredibly predictable play call. They had already run it on the drive. It's the preseason. You're not going to call your best stuff. I don't really think you should. I also think Justin Fields, who wants to become the starting quarterback of this team, he's going to want to see what he can do holding onto the ball. And I'm fine with that. Then the other one. Fields misses that deep ball to second-year Gardner-Webb wide receiver TJ Luther. And everyone's complaining about how it could have been a touchdown if he dropped it into him perfectly. There are a lot of things to criticize in Justin Fields' game. His deep ball is absolutely not one of them. He's been a great deep ball thrower since he was at Ohio State. It is one of his absolute strengths. It is one of the things that will get him to run a functional offense regardless of his efficiency on early downs in the short passing game, whatnot. He can chuck it deep with the best of them. in the NFL. Unfortunately, he did not have the best of them on the field with him in the fourth quarter of that game. So just under 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter. Steelers were down 6. Fields play action deep shot to TJ Luther. And instead of running through it, he completely stops to try to jump 10 feet in the air right at the goal line. And it's not a perfect throw, but it's a lot better throw if there's a better wide receiver on the other end who just continues to run through it and tries to make the catch that way. It's not a guaranteed touchdown because, even if the guy kept running, this is a guy who thought he could jump 13 feet in the air and stuttered on the last 2 steps of a post route. So he's clearly not an NFL receiver, but he's going to get his hands on it if he continues to run through it. It's a much better throw than TJ Luther made it look. I'm not saying that Justin Fields was perfect on Saturday. He was better than he was in preseason week 1, and he was a lot better than Russell Wilson was. And I still don't think it'll matter. I'm pretty certain Russell Wilson is going to be the week 1 starting quarterback for the Steelers because that's what Mike Tomlin wants and has always wanted since he told the media that Wilson is starting the year in pole position. I think the Steelers already have their week 1 starting quarterback. But if he looks the way he did against the Bills, and he doesn't have his mobility, and he can't create in the scramble drill, and he continually takes these short checkdowns because he just wants to get the ball out of his hand because he knows if the pressure does get there, his pressure to sack rate is going to be very high. He's going to get sacked on a lot of those plays because he can't avoid pass rushers anymore at this point in his career. If Wilson continues to play like that, I really don't know that he's going to hold on to the job for very long. I think you absolutely will see both quarterbacks play for the Steelers in the regular season this year. I don't think we'll have our answer heading into next season. If I had to bet which one is back on the roster, I would say Justin Fields because he's going to be younger. Obviously, that's not going to change. I don't think either of these guys is the long-term answer, and I never have. But from what I've seen, and it's a small sample, and preseason doesn't matter, and we learned that with Kenny Pickett, but it is all we have to go off of right now. From what I've seen, I'm way more interested in what Justin Fields can do in the Arthur Smith offense for the Steelers in 2024 than I am in Russell Wilson. And I don't think there's anything Wilson can really do in the final preseason game to change my mind on that. That's it for the show today, guys. Thanks so much for listening along. It's a lot of fun going through the preseason. It's a lot of fun having real football to talk about, and I'm excited for football games that matter to talk about those eventually. We'll have another show next Monday for you. Be sure to check out the show on Wednesday with Tommy and Shane. They do a great job. They've been breaking down the 53-man roster, getting into all the nitty-gritty stuff. When I stay talking about the quarterbacks as long as I do, they give you really great breakdowns on the entire roster, and they've been talking the Brandon Aiyuk situation. They've been absolutely killing it on Wednesdays. So be sure to check that show out and then come back on next Monday at 1:30 Eastern. And we'll be doing it all again with another preseason game to talk about. Until then, go Steelers and have a good week.